Dale had been walking for 2 hours before he saw the orphanage. It sat against the side of the mountain like something the rock had simply forgotten to swallow. The walls were old stone, dark with years of weather, and the roof on the far left corner had begun to sag inward. A thin line of smoke rose from a chimney on the east side, the only sign that anyone inside was still trying. He stopped for a moment and looked at it. He had taken harder jobs than this. He had fixed boilers in flooded basements and rewired heating lines through walls that had not been opened in 50 years. But something about this place felt different before he had even walked through the door. It felt tired. The kind of tired that comes not from one bad season but from many. He shifted the bag on his shoulder and kept walking. The gate was iron, old and slow on its hinges. It opened with a sound like a low groan. A narrow path of flat stones led up to the front door, and on either side of it the ground was hard and frozen. No grass. No growth. Just gray earth and cold. He knocked. The door opened after a long moment, and the dragoness standing in the frame was smaller than he expected. She was old, that much was clear. Her scales were a deep faded green, like leaves that had dried and lost most of their color. She looked at him with steady amber eyes and said nothing at first. "My name is Dale," he said. "I was sent by the district office. About the heating system." She studied him for a moment longer. Then she stepped back and let him in. Her name was Mara. She did not offer it right away, but gave it to him quietly when he asked, the way some people give their name when they are not sure it matters to the person asking. She led him down a narrow hallway and the cold inside the building surprised him. He had expected it to be warmer than outside. It was not. The hall opened into a large common room and that was where he saw them. There were 11 hatchlings in that room. Most were curled together in the center of the floor on a pile of woven blankets. They were small, some no bigger than a large dog, and their scales ranged from pale gray to dull amber. They were pressed close to one another, not playing, not making noise. Just holding still. Trying to stay warm. One of them lifted its head and looked at Dale. Its eyes were pale gold and a little glassy. It looked at him the way sick children look at strangers. Curious but too tired to really care. Dale looked at the room. There was a heating vent low on the far wall. He walked to it and crouched down and held his hand near the grate. There was almost nothing coming out. A faint breath of warmth, barely enough to feel. He stood and turned to Mara. "How long has it been like this?" he asked. "Since early autumn," she said. "It was weak before that. But it stopped working properly when the cold came." He nodded slowly. He asked her to show him the system. She took him down a set of stone steps to a room beneath the building. The boiler was there, large and old and dark with rust along the joints. Pipes ran from it in several directions, and more than one of them had been wrapped with cloth where cracks had formed. The wrapping was damp. That was not a good sign. Dale set his bag down and spent the next hour going through everything carefully. He checked the pressure lines, the fuel connection, the heat exchange points, and the state of the pipes running to the upper floors. He did not rush. He looked at each part the way a man looks at something he already suspects is beyond saving but wants to be sure before he says so. When he was done he stood in the middle of the room with his hands in his pockets and looked at the boiler for a long quiet moment. The main exchange unit was cracked through. The two primary pipes feeding the upper floor had corroded so badly that even replacing the sections he could see would not solve the problem because the damage ran further than he could reach. The fuel line had a slow leak that had been going on long enough to stain the floor beneath it. And the boiler itself was a model he had not seen in over 20 years, which meant parts for it were either rare or simply no longer made. He could patch some of it. He could get it running at maybe half strength if he spent 3 or 4 days on it and sourced the right materials. But it would fail again before the worst of winter arrived. And when it failed the next time, it would fail completely. He climbed back up the steps. Mara was waiting at the top. She did not ask him what he had found. She looked at his face and seemed to already know. "Can you fix it?" she said. "Not in any way that will last," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I see." There was no panic in her voice. No anger. Just a kind of tired acceptance that bothered Dale more than an outburst would have. It was the voice of someone who had been disappointed by things before and had learned to simply carry the weight of it without making a sound. He looked back toward the common room. Through the open doorway he could see the hatchlings still gathered on the blankets. One of the smaller ones had pressed its head against the side of another and closed its eyes. The pale-eyed one that had looked at him earlier was watching the doorway. Watching him. Dale looked at that small face for a moment. Then he looked back at Mara. "I need to make a few calls," he said. "And I need to look at the ground outside the building, the north and east sides especially. Is there any space in the storage room downstairs that I am not using yet?" Mara blinked. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I am not going to fix what is down there," Dale said. "I am going to replace it with something better. Something that does not need fuel and does not have parts that wear out." He picked up his bag from the floor. "It is going to take longer than a repair would. Maybe 8 or 9 days. Possibly more. I will need to source materials and I will need your help carrying some things." Mara looked at him carefully. "You were only sent here to inspect." "I know," Dale said. "The district office did not ask you to do more than that." "I know that too," he said. She studied him for a long moment. Then something in her expression shifted, not quite relief, but something close to it. "The storage room is yours," she said quietly. Dale nodded and walked back toward the front door to begin measuring the ground outside. Behind him the orphanage was cold and the hatchlings were still and the smoke from the chimney was still thin. But he was staying. The second day was colder than the first. Dale knew it before he stepped outside. He could feel it in the stone floor through his boots, a deeper chill than the day before, the kind that settled into walls and did not leave until spring decided to come back. He pulled his coat tighter and went out to the north side of the building with his measuring tape and his notebook. He worked through the morning, marking distances, and checking the ground with a long metal rod he pressed into the earth at different points. He was looking for depth. He was looking for where the mountain's warmth began. It was there, he knew it was there, it was always there if you went deep enough. The question was how deep and whether the ground here would cooperate. It cooperated. By midday he had what he needed from outside and he went back in. Mara had set a bowl of something warm on the table near the window of the small side room she had given him to sleep in. He did not know what was in it but it was hot and that was enough. He ate quickly and opened his notebook and began writing numbers. He did not hear the small sound at first. It came from down the hall. A low sound, not quite a cry, not quite a cough. Something between the two. He stopped writing and listened. It came again. He got up and walked down the hall to the common room. Most of the hatchlings were awake, moving around slowly, a few of them pushing a round stone across the floor between them in something that might have been a game. But near the far wall, on a separate pile of blankets set slightly apart from the others, one hatchling was lying very still. It was the pale-eyed one. The one that had watched him from the doorway the day before. Dale walked over slowly and crouched down. The hatchling looked at him. Its eyes were not as bright as they had been. Its breathing was slow and there was a slight tremor in its sides each time it exhaled, a small visible effort that should not have been there. Mara came in behind him. She had a folded cloth in her hands and she added it to the blankets around the small drake without being asked, tucking the edges in carefully. "This one," Dale said quietly. "What is its name?" "The others call it EMB," Mara said. "It has been like this for 3 days. It was already thin when the cold got worse." "Has it eaten?" "A little. Not enough. Dale looked at EMB for a moment. The hatchling blinked slowly and did not look away from him. There was something very calm in that gaze, something that felt too calm for something so small and so cold. "What do you do for them when this happens?" Dale asked. Mara was quiet for a moment. "We keep them warm as best we can. We keep them fed. We stay close." She paused. "Sometimes it is enough." Dale looked up at her. "And when it is not?" She did not answer right away. She straightened up and looked at the other hatchlings across the room, and her voice when she spoke was flat and even, the way a voice gets when a person has said a hard thing so many times that the emotion has worn smooth off it. "We have lost one or two every winter since I have been here," she said. "Some years more. It is the cold. They are young and some of them came to us already weak. The heating system was never strong enough and the winters here are long." She looked down at EMB. "It is simply the way things are." Dale stood up. He did not say anything for a moment. He stood there in the cold common room with the sound of the hatchlings moving quietly behind him, and he looked at Mara and he felt something settle in his chest, not anger exactly, but something firm and heavy and very decided. "No," he said. Mara looked at him. "It is not simply the way things are," he said. "It is the way things have been because the right solution was never built. Those are different things." Mara held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, not dismissively, but in the way of someone who had heard hopeful words before and had learned to be careful with them. Dale went back to his room and sat down at the table. He opened a fresh page in his notebook and started from the beginning. He had been thinking about a geothermal channel since the day before, a system that pulled warmth from deep in the ground and moved it through the building using the mountain itself as the heat source. He had built something similar once, years ago, for a workshop in the northern hills. That version had been simple, designed for one room and one purpose. What he needed here was different. He needed something that could warm an entire building. Something with enough reach to cover the common room, the sleeping rooms, the hall, and the lower storage space where the cold pooled worst. He drew it out slowly. The main intake shaft would go into the north-facing ground where his measurements showed the warmest subsurface readings. From there a sealed channel would run under the foundation and connect to a distribution loop inside the building. The loop would run along the lower walls of each room, close to the floor where the hatchlings slept and rested. Heat rises. That was the simple truth at the center of everything. Put the warmth at the bottom and let it rise through the space on its own. No fuel. No moving parts that could corrode. No boiler that could crack and fail in the middle of the worst week of winter. He worked through the afternoon. By the time the light outside faded he had 3 full pages of notes and a rough diagram that he was mostly satisfied with. There were things he still needed to think through. The depth of the intake shaft worried him because the ground near the mountain had layers of rock that might slow the digging. The distribution loop would need specific pipe material, the kind that held heat without losing it through the walls, and he was not sure how much of it he could get delivered to a place this remote. He wrote a list of materials. Then he wrote it again more carefully, cutting anything that could be substituted for something simpler. Then he looked at the list and thought about what he could build himself from what was already in the storage room downstairs. The list got shorter. He could do this. He went to check on EMB before he went to sleep. The hatchling was still in the same spot, still and quiet under its blankets. One of the other hatchlings, a small amber-scaled one, had come over at some point and was pressed against EMB's side. Just sitting there. Not doing anything. Just being close. Dale stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at them. Then he went back to his room and kept working. The digging started on the 3rd day. Dale was up before the sun. He had his tools laid out the night before, the long-handled spade, the narrow pick, the metal rod he used for testing depth, and a coil of rope he would need once the shaft got deep enough to require a way to pull loose rock up from the bottom. He dressed in the dark, drank something hot that Mara had left covered on the table, and went outside. The cold hit him like a flat hand. He stood for a moment and let his body adjust to it. The mountain rose behind the orphanage in the early gray light, very still, very large. The ground under his boots was frozen at the surface, but he already knew from his measurements that the frost only went down so far. Beneath it the earth was different. Older. Warmer than anything above it had a right to be. He set the pick against the ground and started. The first hour was the hardest. The surface layer was nearly solid and the pick rang against it with a sound that echoed off the stone walls of the orphanage. He worked in a rhythm, strike and lift and strike again, stopping every few minutes to clear the broken pieces with the spade. Slowly, slowly, the hole opened up. By the time the sky had gone from gray to pale white, he was knee-deep. He did not hear the door open behind him. He heard the sound of small claws on the frozen path and turned to find 3 of the hatchlings standing a few feet away, watching him. They were the 3 largest ones, their scales dark gray and amber in the morning light. They stood very still with their heads slightly tilted, looking at the hole and then at Dale and then at the hole again. Dale straightened up and wiped his face with the back of his hand. "I could use help moving the loose rock," he said. "That pile there. If you carry it to the far side of the wall it keeps the working space clear." They looked at each other. Then the largest one walked forward, picked up a chunk of broken rock in both front feet, and carried it to the wall. The other 2 followed. After that they came every morning. Sometimes more of them came, 4 or 5 crowding around the edge of the shaft and watching Dale work before finding something useful to do. They carried rock. They held the rope when he needed it. One of them figured out on its own that keeping the tools in a neat line was helpful and began doing it without being asked. Dale never told them to do any of it. They simply watched and found their place in the work the way curious young things sometimes do. He talked to them while he worked. Not instructions, just words. He explained what he was doing in simple terms, the way he might explain it to someone who had never seen this kind of work before. He told them about heat moving through the earth, about how the mountain held warmth in its deep rock the way a stone holds warmth from the sun long after the sun goes down. He told them what the channel would do once it was finished, how the warmth would travel through pipes under the floor and rise through the rooms and stay there through the night. They listened. He did not know how much they understood. But they listened. Inside the orphanage, in the common room, a pale face watched from the window. EMB had not been well enough to come outside. Mara had said so firmly on the second morning when the hatchling had tried to follow the others to the door. Too cold. Too soon. EMB had gone back to the blankets without argument but had moved them closer to the window, and every morning when Dale came around the north side of the building with his tools, he would look up and EMB would already be there, watching. Dale got into the habit of giving a small nod when he saw the pale eyes in the window. EMB always blinked back. It seemed to be enough for both of them. The shaft reached the right depth on the 5th day. Dale climbed down into it carefully, checked the temperature of the earth at the bottom with his bare hand pressed flat against the wall, and felt the warmth coming through. Steady. Quiet. Reliable in the way only very old things are reliable. He climbed back out and started on the channel. The channel ran from the bottom of the shaft under the foundation of the building, a trench he dug by hand in sections, lining it carefully with the flat stones Mara had found stacked behind the storage room. The hatchlings carried the stones. They formed a loose chain, passing them from one to the next, and they were surprisingly careful with it, setting each stone down gently rather than dropping it. The nights were the hardest part. Dale worked after the hatchlings had gone inside, after Mara had brought him something to eat and stood watching him for a while before going back in herself. He worked by lantern light, the yellow glow throwing long shadows across the frozen ground. His hands got stiff in the cold and he had to stop sometimes and press them together and wait for the feeling to come back before he could continue. But he did not stop for long. He thought about EMB watching from the window in the mornings. He thought about what Mara had said in the flat, even voice of someone who had accepted a terrible thing as normal. 1 or 2 every winter. He thought about the amber-scaled hatchling that had pressed itself against EMB's side in the dark, not knowing what else to do, only knowing that being close was better than leaving the small one alone. He kept working. The pipe installation took 2 full days. He had sourced the material from a supplier 3 towns down the mountain who had agreed to send it up by cart, and when it arrived Dale checked every length of it carefully before laying it into the channel. The hatchlings watched this part with particular interest, following the pipe with their eyes as each section went in, as if they were beginning to understand the shape of what was being built. On the evening of the 8th day Dale sealed the last connection, covered the external channel with flat stones and packed earth, and stood up straight for the first time in what felt like hours. He looked at the building. The pipes were in. The channel was sealed. The shaft was complete. Tomorrow he would connect the interior loop and test the whole system from one end to the other. He looked up at the window out of habit. EMB was still there in the fading light, pale eyes steady, watching him the way the hatchling had watched him every day since the work began. There was something in that gaze that was hard to name. Not hope exactly. Something quieter than hope. Something that had not been there on the first day when Dale had crouched beside the sick little Drake and seen eyes that were too calm and too tired. Dale gave his small nod. EMB blinked slowly. Dale picked up his tools and went inside. The 9th morning was quiet. Dale was up early again, but not to dig. Not to carry pipe or press his hands against frozen earth or work by lantern light until his fingers stopped feeling the cold. He sat at the small table in his room with a cup of something warm and looked at his notebook and went through every step of the system one more time in his head. He had checked the connections twice the night before. He had walked the interior loop from one end to the other, pressing his hand against each joint, feeling for any weakness. Everything held. Everything was where it needed to be. But he checked again anyway. That was the kind of man Dale was. Not a man who doubted himself, but a man who knew that the difference between something working and something working reliably was usually one careful check that someone had decided to skip. He finished his cup and went downstairs. The connection point was in the lower storage room, where the interior loop met the channel coming in from the shaft outside. It was a simple valve, the kind you open slowly and then wait. Dale crouched beside it and put his hand on the pipe running from the channel. Even through the stone of the wall he could feel it. The faint steady warmth from deep in the mountain, patient and quiet, waiting to be let through. He opened the valve. For a moment nothing seemed to happen. Then he felt it. A slow movement in the pipe under his palm. Not heat yet, just movement, the warmth beginning its long travel from the shaft through the channel and into the loop that ran beneath the floors and along the lower walls of every room. He stayed crouched and waited and did not move. 2 minutes passed. Then the pipe under his hand grew warm. Dale let out a breath he had not known he was holding. He pressed his whole palm flat against the pipe and felt the warmth moving steadily through it, not a burst, not a surge, just a slow and even and completely reliable flow of heat coming up from the mountain itself. He sat down on the floor of the storage room and closed his eyes for a moment. Then he got up and went to tell Mara. She was in the hall when he came up the steps. She looked at his face and something in her expression shifted, a small careful movement, like a door opening just slightly before someone decides whether to open it fully. "It is running," Dale said. Mara said nothing. She walked past him to the storage room steps and went down. He heard her stop at the bottom. He heard silence. Then he heard her come back up slowly. She did not say anything when she reached the hall. She just stood there for a moment with her hands folded in front of her and her amber eyes very still. "Come and feel the floor in the common room," Dale said. They walked there together. The hatchlings were already awake, moving around in their usual morning way. But something was different. One of them was sitting directly on the floor instead of on the blankets, its head low, pressing its chin against the stone. It looked puzzled in the way young creatures look puzzled when something they have never experienced before turns out to be pleasant. The floor was warm. Not hot. Not uncomfortable. Just genuinely, steadily warm in the way that a room is supposed to be warm in the deep of winter. The kind of warmth that settles into the air and the walls and the floor and simply stays there. One by one the other hatchlings noticed. They came off the blankets and pressed their feet against the floor and stood there looking at each other and then at the floor and then at Dale. The amber-scaled one that always stayed near EMB walked a slow circle in the middle of the room as if checking whether the warmth was the same everywhere. It was. Dale looked toward the corner where EMB's blankets were. The pale-eyed hatchling was sitting up. Not lying down, not pressed flat and still the way it had been for days. Sitting up with its head raised and its eyes brighter than Dale had seen them since he arrived. EMB pressed one small foot flat against the warm floor and held it there and looked at Dale with an expression that needed no words at all. Dale nodded. By evening the change in the building was something you could feel the moment you walked in from outside. The cold that had lived in the walls and the hall and the corners of every room for as long as the orphanage had stood was simply gone. Not reduced. Gone. The air was clear and warm and the kind of still that only comes when a space is truly comfortable. The hatchlings gathered in the common room after the evening meal, not in their usual tight pile on the blankets, not pressed together out of necessity. They gathered loosely, spread across the warm floor, some of them lying flat with their bellies against the stone, some of them sitting in small groups. EMB was among them, not at the edge, not separate, but in the middle of the room with the amber-scaled one close by. They were not gathering because they were cold. They were gathering because they wanted to be together. Dale sat in the doorway of the common room and watched them. Mara came and stood beside him after a while. She stood there for a long time without speaking and Dale did not push her to. When she did speak, her voice was low and even, but it was different from the flat tired voice she had used before. There was something older in it now. Something that had been kept in a quiet place for a long time. She told him about the orphanage. She told him it had been built over 60 years ago by a Drake elder who had lost her own clutch to a hard winter and decided that no hatchling without family should face the cold alone. She told him how it had been warm once, long ago, when the original system was new. How the winters had slowly won as the years passed and the system aged and the district support grew thinner and the requests for repairs were answered with delays and then with silence. She told him about the winters. About the hatchlings she had known by name who had not made it to spring. About the ones who had survived but carried the cold in them for years afterward, slow to grow, slow to trust, as if something in them had learned too early that warmth was not something that lasted. She did not cry. She simply told him, in the quiet steady way of someone setting down something heavy they have carried alone for a very long time. Dale listened to all of it without speaking. When she was done the common room was warm and the hatchlings were still and EMB was asleep in the middle of the floor with both feet pressed flat against the warm stone. Dale looked at all of it for a long moment. "It will hold," he said quietly. "All winter. And the one after that." Mara looked at him. "I know," she said. And for the first time since Dale had arrived, she sounded like she meant it. Dale began packing on the 11th day. He did not pack quickly. He moved through the small room slowly, folding things and setting them in order, checking his tools one by one before wrapping them and placing them in the bag. It was the same way he did most things. Carefully. Without rushing. Making sure nothing important was left behind or left undone. But before the bag was closed he sat down at the table one more time and opened a fresh notebook. He had been thinking about the guide for 2 days. Not just what to put in it but how to write it. Technical knowledge written in technical language was useless to someone who had never worked with systems like this. Mara was capable and careful and had kept this orphanage running on almost nothing for years, but she was not an engineer. The older hatchlings who helped carry parts and hold rope were strong and willing, but they were young. Whatever he wrote had to be simple enough that anyone in that building could read it, follow it, and fix what needed fixing without needing to call anyone. He wrote slowly and clearly. He started with the valve in the storage room. He drew a small diagram of it, labeled each part with plain words, and wrote step by step what to check and when. He moved from there to the interior loop, explaining the signs that would tell Mara if a joint was losing pressure, what it would feel like underfoot, what to listen for in the pipes on a very cold night. He wrote about the shaft outside, how to keep the intake clear of debris in autumn before the freeze came, how to check that nothing had shifted in the ground around it after a hard frost. He wrote a section on the hatchlings. On what the warmth should feel like in each room and how to tell if a room was not getting enough. He wrote it not as a technical note but as a simple instruction. If the floor in the sleeping room feels cooler than the common room floor, check the joint at the east wall connection first. Simple. Direct. Anyone could follow it. He filled 12 pages. Then he went through all 12 pages again and crossed out any word that could be replaced with a simpler one. When he was done, he set the notebook on the table and called for Mara. She came in and sat across from him and he walked her through every page. He did not rush it. He read each section aloud and then asked her to read it back in her own words to make sure the meaning had come through clearly. Where it had not, he rewrote the sentence on the spot. They spent 2 hours at that table and by the end of it Mara knew the system the way Dale knew it. Not with the deep instinct of someone who had built it, but with the solid practical knowledge of someone who could keep it running and would know exactly what to do when something needed attention. She asked good questions. That did not surprise him. In the afternoon he took the 3 oldest hatchlings outside and showed them the shaft and the external channel. He pointed to the places that would need clearing before winter each year, showed them how to check that the flat stones covering the channel were still properly seated, and demonstrated how to tell from the surface of the ground whether anything had shifted beneath. They watched everything closely. The largest one pressed its nose against the ground near the shaft intake and sniffed at it for a long moment, which Dale decided probably meant it was paying attention in its own way. He made them a separate set of drawings. Simpler than the ones in the notebook. Just pictures with short labels, showing each part of the outside system and what it should look like when everything was right. He folded the drawings and gave them to the largest hatchling, who held them very carefully as if it understood what they were for. That evening Dale finished packing. He set his bag by the door and went to the common room one last time. The hatchlings were there, spread across the warm floor the way they had been every evening since the system came to life. The room was golden with lantern light and warm and quiet in the way it had not been when he arrived. They knew he was leaving. He was not sure how they knew, but they did. Animals and young things often understood more than people expected them to. They watched him come in and the room got a little stiller. Dale sat down on the floor among them. He did not say anything. There was nothing that needed to be said. He just sat with them for a while in the warm room and let the evening go by at its own pace. One of the smaller hatchlings came and pressed its head against his knee and stayed there. Another one moved closer and lay down near his feet. They did not make sounds. They just came close, one by one, in the quiet way of creatures who do not have words but know how to show what something means to them. Dale sat with them for a long time. He was almost ready to get up when he heard the small sound beside him. EMB was there. The pale-eyed hatchling had come up without Dale noticing, moving quietly across the warm floor, and was now sitting directly in front of him. EMB looked well. Better than Dale had ever seen since arriving. The glassiness was gone from those pale gold eyes and the tremor in the small sides was gone and the hatchling held itself straight and steady in a way that had not been possible 2 weeks ago. EMB looked at him for a moment. Then the hatchling lifted one small foot and opened it. Sitting in the center of EMB's palm was a stone. It was smooth and dark, about the size of Dale's thumbnail, and it had a faint warmth to it as if it had been held close for a very long time. It was not a special-looking stone. It was not carved or shaped or marked in any way. But the way EMB held it out told Dale clearly that it was not ordinary. He looked at Mara. She was standing in the doorway watching. Her expression was very still. "They find them," she said quietly. "Each one finds its own. They keep them close. They only give them to someone they consider part of their family." Dale looked back at EMB. The pale gold eyes were steady and calm and completely certain. Dale reached out slowly and took the stone from EMB's small foot. It was warm in his hand. He closed his fingers around it gently and held it there. He did not trust his voice for a moment. When he did speak, it came out low and simple and honest. "Thank you," he said. EMB blinked once slowly. Then the hatchling turned and walked back to the center of the warm floor and lay down among the others. Dale stood up. He looked at the room one last time. The warm floor. The easy way the hatchlings lay scattered and comfortable and together. The lantern light on old stone walls that did not feel cold anymore. He walked to the door where Mara was standing. She did not say anything and neither did he. Some things did not need words. He picked up his bag and walked out into the cold mountain morning. The stone was in his pocket. It stayed warm the whole way down.